With this grounding in the nature of Sharia, the goals and activities of the Muslim Brotherhood to impose it worldwide, and an introduction to the Brotherhood's civilization jihad against the United States, let's take a closer look at one of the Ikhwan's most successful influence operations: its penetration and manipulation of the Republican Party and the conservative movement in America. For some, it seems incredible that the Muslim Brotherhood would try to suborn the conservative movement and the Republican Party, but knowing what we now do about the organization and its operations, it's actually inconceivable that the Muslim Brotherhood would not try to do so. After all, as we've seen, the Brotherhood's civilization jihad in America has targeted seemingly every governmental agency and pillar of U.S. civil society in the interest of destroying this country from within and by our hands. What's more, the Muslim Brotherhood would logically assign a particularly high priority to neutralizing the right in America, since it could be expected to be among the most likely of communities to oppose the civilization jihad. It was, let's recall, the right in America that was, particularly under Ronald Reagan, at the forefront of the effort to defeat the previous totalitarian ideology, Soviet communism. As Sharia has been tellingly described as communism with a god, and since the Islamists learned much about the tradecraft with respect to stealthy war against the United States and the West from the Soviets, it's actually unimaginable that the Muslim Brotherhood would have neglected an opportunity to take out a formidable and potentially deadly adversary, namely the American right. This strategic play was all the more obvious by the late 1990s, since much of the American left had already been co-opted. Despite the obvious incompatibility between the left's priorities on the one hand and, on the other, Sharia, with its extreme, even violent intolerance for women's rights, homosexuals, Jews, music, drugs, alcohol, and free expression, leftists in this country have long been among the Islamists' most aggressive allies and defenders. As we've seen, the Soviets made common cause with Arab radicals during the Cold War. In more recent times, there have been many examples of such popular fronts in the United States and elsewhere in the West. These have been dubbed red-green coalitions, reflecting the colors associated with communists and others on the radical left, and the Islamists, respectively. Arguably, no one has understood these ties better and done more to document them than a former radical leftist, David Horowitz. After he broke with his fellow communists and became a brilliant and courageous conservative leader, Horowitz published a best-selling treatment of the red-green axis entitled Unholy Alliance: Radical Islam and the American Left. His David Horowitz Freedom Center has also sponsored a valuable resource for tracking and defeating the myriad leftist and Islamist operatives and groups, and their arrangements for making common cause against America. He calls it discoverthenetworks.org. To cite just one example of a red-green partnership, the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom was established in 1997 by a top Islamist based in Florida, Professor Sami Al-Arian. Al-Arian named Kit Gage as the coalition's executive director. Gage was the executive vice president of a leading communist front group, the National Lawyers Guild. We'll have much more to say about Al-Arian and his national coalition in a moment, but suffice it to say that David Horowitz's Front Page magazine characterized it as, quote, a lobby for terror, unquote. A further factor in the Islamists' successful co-option of the left came about as a result of Democrats' concerted outreach in the 1990s to Muslim Americans as a source of campaign contributions and votes. One of the most important facilitators of this outreach and fundraising effort was a prominent Muslim American activist named Abdurrahman Alamoudi. He was the founder of what became during this period a particularly effective Brotherhood front, the American Muslim Council. He also served in leadership capacities in many other Ikhwan-tied organizations. Alamoudi proved particularly adept at soliciting political and charitable contributions from, among others, his fellow leaders of Brotherhood Front organizations in this country. The Clinton-Gore administration reciprocated for al-Amoudi's help in fundraising for the Democratic Party and its candidates in various ways. He was used as a liaison with the Muslim community in America and as a goodwill ambassador with those overseas. Al-Amoudi also served as an advisor to the administration on the Middle East peace process. Most importantly, the Clinton-Gore team gave Al-Amoudi the responsibility for selecting, training, and credentialing Muslim chaplains for the U.S. military and prison system. A few days before the 2000 election, Al-Amoudi let his mask slip at an anti-Israel demonstration in Washington's Lafayette Square, sponsored by his and other Muslim Brotherhood fronts. Al-Amoudi shouted, "Hear that, Bill Clinton? We are all supporters of Hamas here. And Hezbollah. Allahu Akbar." This was not the first time Al-Amoudi expressed similar jihadist sentiments, including his desire to see Sharia brought to America. But this one was too public to be ignored, as his previous statements had been by U.S. government officials and others. This outburst blighted somewhat Al-Amoudi's ability to conduct influence operations. But the chaplains he selected, trained, and credentialed have not been removed from their duties or even subjected to careful scrutiny, despite a formal request by then Defense Department Inspector General Joseph Schmitz, who subsequently served as a member of Team B2. That's all the more unbelievable in light of the fact that 3 years later Abdurrahman al-Amoudi was arrested and sent to prison on terrorism-related charges. Al-Amoudi had plotted to kill the then Crown Prince, now King of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. Al-Amoudi got a total of $500,000 to take out Abdullah from Libya's tyrannical Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Al-Amoudi also acknowledged providing $1 million in funds to the designated terrorist group Al-Qaeda, making him one of Osama bin Laden's top fundraisers in America. The question recurs, what about the loyalties of the chaplains Al-Amoudi selected, trained, and placed in our military and prisons?
On November 10, 2004, then Defense Department Inspector General Joseph Schmitz issued an evaluation report on the Pentagon's chaplain program. In it, he raised concerns about the loyalty of chaplains selected, trained, and certified first by an organization run by Abdurrahman al-Amoudi and subsequently and presently by a subsidiary of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States, the Islamic Society of North America. As late as November 2010, ISNA's Dr. Louis Safi was one of the Defense Department's chaplain-endorsing agents. He was also an unindicted co-conspirator in Sami al-Arian's 2006 trial on terrorism-related charges. Inspector General Schmitz's recommendations for corrective action went unheeded at the time, and despite his urging Congress to investigate the matter further in December 2010, have still yet to be acted upon.
Back in 1998, before such revelations made indisputable concerns about al-Amoudi's Islamist sympathies, ties, and activities, the presidential campaign to replace Bill Clinton was getting underway in earnest. Al-Amoudi and his brothers in the Ikhwan had at least two compelling reasons to want to replicate the Muslim Brotherhood's success in penetrating the ranks of the American left and Democratic Party with their conservative and GOP counterparts. First, as we've seen, the success of the Brotherhood's civilization jihad could be threatened if the right were not neutralized. And second, that civilization jihad benefited greatly from the legitimization, access, and influence the Clinton-Gore team afforded its operatives. If for no other reason, the Ikhwan would have wanted to ensure its continued ability to place Muslim Brotherhood-approved chaplains in two of the most lucrative populations for jihadist recruitment, the U.S. military and felons. If the Brotherhood played its cards right, it could retain that responsibility, even if the Republicans defeated the Democratic nominee, Vice President Al Gore. As it happened, the Muslim Brotherhood's interest in penetrating the right coincided with an interest within certain Republican circles to engage in outreach to the Muslim American community. Three prominent GOP and conservative operatives reportedly saw, for various reasons, a need to establish close ties with Muslim Americans: lobbyist Jack Abramoff, tax reform advocate Grover Norquist, and political strategist Karl Rove. This was not their first collaboration. The three had been close colleagues since they first served together in the leadership of college Republicans. According to an account provided by Abramoff, one reason for such an outreach was that Muslim Americans appeared to be a promising new constituency for the Republican Party, and its leading candidate for the GOP nomination, then Texas Governor George W. Bush, for whom Karl Rove worked as chief campaign strategist. This constituency was seen as potentially capable of being for the Republicans what Jews have long been for the Democratic Party, a well-heeled, generous, and reliable voting bloc. Other considerations also evidently made an effort to include Muslims in the conservative Republican coalition appear attractive to at least two of these GOP operatives. As we shall see, among such considerations apparently were business opportunities for Jack Abramoff and revenue streams for Grover Norquist. In 1998, Alamoudi joined forces with Grover Norquist to found the Islamic Free Market Institute, better known as the Islamic Institute, or II. Checks in the public domain indicate that in 1999, Abdurrahman Alamoudi gave or lent the Islamic Institute at least $20,000 in seed money from his own personal account. It's unclear whether he provided additional funds to the Institute, and if so, how much. These funds alone, however, represented almost 12% of the contributions received by the organization in that year, according to an Institute 990 filing with the IRS. In addition, Alamoudi ensured his control of the Institute as a vehicle for penetrating and running influence operations against the conservative movement by installing his right-hand man, Khalid Safuri, as its first executive director. Safuri was also given the title of President of the Islamic Free Market Institute Foundation. In the 1990s, Safuri, who's originally of Palestinian extraction, worked as Director for Government Affairs and Executive Director of the American Muslim Council, the highly effective Muslim Brotherhood front group and influence operation that Alamoudi personally founded and ran. Safuri also collaborated with Alamoudi in the American Task Force for Bosnia, an organization that sought to aid the Muslim population there after Yugoslavia's violent breakup. At the time, this cause happened to be a top agenda item and recruiting vehicle for international jihadists around the world. In his spare time, Safuri reportedly helped Jewish lobbyist Jack Abramoff secure clients for his lobbying operations, including Mahathir Mohamad, the virulent anti-Semite who was then Prime Minister of Malaysia. The hope, evidently, was that this representational arrangement would translate in short order into Safuri-brokered entree to Qatar and other wealthy Muslim oil states in the Middle East as well. Jack Abramoff was not the only one who sought to benefit financially from the GOP Muslim Outreach Initiative. Apparently, Grover Norquist was also able to cash in on his relationship with Alamoudi together with David Safavian, his then partner in a lobbying firm they founded in 1997, Janus Merit Strategies. According to lobbying registration forms filed by Janus Merit, the company represented Abdurrahman Alamoudi during the 2000-2001 period. After Safavian joined the Bush administration, Janus Merit's registration forms were changed to declare that instead of Alamoudi, the firm represented Jamal al-Barzinji. There's a certain out-of-the-frying-pan, into-the-fire quality to this action, since Barzinji is at least as pedigreed an Ikhwan civilization jihadist as is Alamoudi. After all, Barzinji was president of the Muslim Students Association, the original Muslim Brotherhood front organization in the United States, and has been involved with or funded a number of others over the years. For example, he is one of the founders of the North American Islamic Trust, NATE, a past leader of the Islamic Society of North America, vice president of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, and a major contributor to the radical Sharia-adherent Dar al-Hijra Mosque al-Awaki, formerly led in Falls Church, Virginia. The obvious question is, in light of what was easily ascertainable about the Muslim Brotherhood ties and jihadist sympathies and associations of the so-called community leaders with whom Jack Abramoff, Grover Norquist, and Karl Rove were working, what did these prominent Republicans know? and when did they know it? Certainly, by the beginning of the Bush 43 administration, there could be no plausible deniability about al-Amouti's true nature for anyone associated with the Islamic Institute. After all, in October 2000, he'd made known his support for Hamas and Hezbollah at the rally in Lafayette Square, an event that was, by the way, sponsored by the Islamic Free Market Institute, among other Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated groups. For that matter, in 1998, al-Amouti had said, quote, "If we are outside this country, we can say, 'Oh Allah, destroy America,'" unquote. Then, early in 2001, al-Amouti participated with some 400 other top jihadists in an international terrorists strategy session in Beirut. As Fox News reported, this meeting brought together, quote, "the world's most extreme Islamic terror groups to set aside their differences and unite for jihad, holy war, against Israel and the United States," unquote. Despite such jihadist connections, or more likely, because of them, the al-Amouti Safuri team generated significant sums to support the Muslim Brotherhood's conservative influence operation. According to the Islamic Free Market Institute Foundation's 990 reports to the Internal Revenue Service, the organization had revenues of over $2.7 million between 1998 and 2006, the last year for which such reports are available. A principal source of such revenues appears to have been a series of conferences the Islamic Institute sponsored starting in 2002. The first was an International Islamic Finance Conference held in Washington, D.C. in September of that year. Its purpose was advertised as bringing the financial world together. The sponsoring organization, the General Council for Islamic Banks and Financial Institutions, must have greatly appreciated the value of a conservative-affiliated Muslim organization introducing it to an official Washington that was, at the time, fully in Republican hands. In fact, this conference amounted to a prime example of civilization jihad, combining an effective influence operation with what is, as we have seen, a leading edge of the stealth jihadist campaign in the West, Sharia-compliant finance. The Islamic bankers paid handsomely for the Institute's help. According to its 990 filing for 2002, a conference that year generated $48,000 for the Islamic Free Market Institute Foundation. That represented approximately 10% of the organization's declared revenue for that year. This event evidently also paid dividends insofar as it impressed new sponsors. In each of the 3 subsequent years, the Islamic Free Market Institute Foundation declared that it had spent between $170,000 and $263,000 on international conferences dealing with, quote, democracy and free markets, unquote. Even more important than the fundraising capabilities of this influence operation were the host of benefits the Islamists immediately enjoyed, thanks to their association with Grover Norquist and the Islamic Institute's co-location with his organization, Americans for Tax Reform. By recruiting a man best known for his no new taxes pledge to serve as what Soviet influence Operation Tradecraft called an agent of influence, the Brotherhood's al-Amouti Safuri team instantly secured a degree of conservative political coloration and legitimacy that it might otherwise have taken years to cultivate, if it could have been achieved at all. Grover Norquist's relationships with Republican, conservative, and libertarian politicians, and the cohort of think tanks, political action committees, lobbying organizations, and other groups that support, or try to influence them, afforded al-Amouti's team extraordinary opportunities to engage in their own influence operations, of the civilization jihadist kind. The centerpiece of Grover Norquist's networking activities is what some have described as the Grand Central Station of the conservative movement, a meeting that Norquist convenes each Wednesday morning in Washington of what he calls the Center-Right Coalition. The heart of Grover Norquist's networking activities is the Wednesday morning meeting of what he calls the Center-Right Coalition, and others have dubbed the Grand Central Station of the conservative movement. During my time in the Wednesday meetings, I witnessed Grover Norquist routinely giving prominent positions at the Center-Right Coalition's table and on his weekly agenda to Khalid Safuri, other Islamic Institute personnel, and their friends. I happen to have seen such mainstreaming firsthand. In fact, my own organization, the Center for Security Policy, sublet space from Americans for Tax Reform. That's right. For 7 long years, we shared elevators, a hallway, lavatories, a conference space, and even a Xerox room. I consider this unlikely arrangement to have been really an act of providence. Had I not been given such a vantage point, including for several years regular participation in Norquist's Wednesday meetings, I would have been far less equipped to provide this course. As it happened, shortly after we moved into our offices, one of my colleagues pulled me aside and asked, "Do you know there's an Islamist front group on the other side of that Xerox room?" I didn't at the time, but from then until now, I have been trying to make sure, privately at first and publicly since early in 2003, that conservatives and other Americans are aware of the help Grover Norquist has given and is giving to the Muslim Brotherhood and others promoting the Sharia agenda in America. Let's examine in detail the nature and the implications of that help. It's bad enough that he was by so doing compromising what the military calls the operational security of political and other strategies discussed at those meetings. Norquist was also thereby credentialing Muslim Brotherhood operatives, and thus presenting to the Wednesday meeting and others individuals who would otherwise never be mistaken for conservative Republicans. Particularly worrying was the extent to which this credentialing translated into access for such individuals, first to George W. Bush's 2000 campaign for the presidency, then, after Mr. Bush's election, to his administration. Let's explore 6 examples of the Norquist-enabled Muslim Brotherhood effort to penetrate and influence the Bush 43 team, in the process giving rise to precedents and openings for Brotherhood civilization jihad operations that continue at an intensified level today. We've already been introduced to Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, the top Muslim brother who, after years of close collaboration with the Clinton-Gore administration and the Democratic Party, set up the Islamic Free Market Institute to gain access for his team to the GOP. As a result, he was one of a group of prominent Islamists who were invited to meet then-candidate Bush at the governor's mansion in Austin in May 2000. We've also met Khalid Safouri, who moved from being al-Amoudi's right-hand man at the American Muslim Council to being his trusted executive director at the Islamic Free Market Institute. Norquist arranged for Safouri to become the coordinator for the Bush 2000 campaign's Muslim outreach. Not surprisingly, the Muslims the Bush team subsequently reached out to were, with few if any exceptions, Islamists like al-Amoudi, with whom Safouri is shown here at the governor's mansion in Austin. Another prominent American Islamist is Niad Awad. Back in October 1993, Awad was a leader of the Islamic Association for Palestine. Recall that the IAP was one of the groups listed on the attachment to the Brotherhood's explanatory memorandum we discussed in Part 2 of this course. On October 3, 1993, Niad Awad joined other Muslim Brotherhood operatives to found a new organization, the Council on American Islamic Relations, better known as CAIR. The meeting was wiretapped by the FBI because it was a gathering of the Palestine Committee in the United States. The Palestine Committee had been established by the American Ikhwan after the adoption of a resolution by the International Muslim Brotherhood aimed at gaining, quote, media, money, and men for the Palestinian cause, unquote. Documents in the government's possession reveal that by Palestinian cause, the Brotherhood meant the Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas. Transcripts of this 1993 meeting were introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial. Awad continues to serve as CAIR's executive director. Despite Niad Awad's long and known record of involvement with Hamas and other Muslim Brotherhood operations, he was one of the Muslim community leaders the al-Amoudi Norquist Safouri team arranged to have President Bush reach out to after 9/11. Here he's shown next to Mr. Bush in a photo op of the president admiring the Saudi-financed Islamic Center of Washington. Khalid Safuri and other Islamists were also featured prominently with Mr. Bush. Thanks to Niyad Awad's leadership in the civilization jihad, CARE earned the dubious distinction of being listed by federal prosecutors as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial. CARE was also listed as one of the members of the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestine Committee. In other words, the government has formally declared in court that CARE is Hamas. On the basis of the evidence provided in that case, no fewer than 4 federal judges, 1 at the trial level, 3 at the appellate level, upheld the validity of that designation. When the presiding jurist in the 2008 proceeding, District Judge Jorge Solis, rejected a request by CARE and 2 other unindicted co-conspirators to have that designation expunged, his ruling said, in part, quote, "The government has produced ample evidence to establish the associations of CARE, ISNA, and NATE with the Holy Land Foundation, the Islamic Association of Palestine, and with Hamas," unquote. We've also met Sami Al-Arian. As was discussed earlier in this course, Al-Arian was the Muslim activist who founded the red-green popular front group known as the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom. It's now been renamed the Defending Dissent Foundation. At the time, Al-Arian's ostensible day job was that of a professor of computer sciences at the University of South Florida. It turned out that Sami Al-Arian had another job. He used his position at the university as a cover for his role as one of the top figures in the Islamist terrorist group Palestinian Islamic Jihad. PIJ, as it's known, is believed to have been responsible for at least 100 deaths in the Middle East. Is there any question that Sami Al-Arian was deeply involved in Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Long before Sami Al-Arian's February 2003 arrest and 2005 trial on terrorism charges, his Islamist friends and their allies on the radical left decried criticism of him as racism and bigotry. Even after Al-Arian pled guilty to 1 count of supporting a terrorist organization, many of them have continued to insist that he's an innocent man, a prisoner of conscience who was falsely accused and wrongly prosecuted for his unpopular views on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Senior U.S. District Judge James Moody, however, who presided in Al-Arian's trial, was under no such illusions, however. The judge chastised Al-Arian in 2006, saying, quote, "You looked your neighbors in the eyes and said you had nothing to do with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. This trial exposed that as a lie. Your backup claim is that your efforts were only to provide charities for widows and orphans. That, too, is a lie. The evidence was clear in this case that you were a leader of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You were on the board of directors and an officer, the secretary. Directors control the actions of an organization, even the PIJ. And you were an active leader." Unquote. Al-Arian would not be arrested for his involvement with Palestinian Islamic Jihad until nearly 3 years after this picture was taken of him with his family, and then candidate George W. Bush, at a campaign stop in Florida. Federal authorities certainly knew of Al-Arian's role in the terrorist group well before March 2000, though. In the course of his trial, the government produced wiretaps dating back to 1994, in which Al-Arian argued with other PIJ leaders about the future direction of the organization. So how did an Islamist running an international terrorist organization get this close to a future president of the United States? Presumably, most of Mr. Bush's political team was ignorant of Al-Arian's PIJ connection and was persuaded that such a meeting was in order simply to demonstrate the importance the candidate attached to the Muslim community and thus to cement its support for his campaign. Given their own Islamist sympathies and agendas, however, it is inconceivable that Abdurrahman al-Amoudi and Khalid Safuri and probably others at the Islamic Institute were similarly clueless about those of Sami Al-Arian. To reinforce the notion that Al-Arian's ground game had been decisive for Mr. Bush, Grover Norquist went so far as to write in the American Spectator immediately after the election that, quote, George W. Bush was elected President of the United States of America because of the Muslim vote, unquote, in Florida. In other words, Norquist wanted the new administration to remember that Sammy Al-Arian and his team delivered for the Texas governor. As one wit caustically observed in response, given the closeness of that hanging Chad-fraught election, red-haired Ugandans could have claimed they decided the Florida election. Still, Norquist's pushing that line could only have helped reinforce his Islamist cadre's claims on positive treatment in the new Bush 43 administration. In fact, two such claims were presumably exactly what the Bush campaign's Muslim outreach coordinator, Khalid Safuri, and his Islamist friends had in mind in arranging this photo op. The first was the reasonable expectation that such tangible proof of Al-Arian's access to George W. Bush could come in handy in the event law enforcement tried to prosecute the professor over his secret Palestinian Islamic Jihad operation. The second imperative was Al-Arian's passionate determination to block the use of what he called secret evidence. What is secret evidence? Well, this is a pejorative term Islamists like Al-Arian and their friends on the radical left apply to classified information withheld from non-American defendants in federal judicial proceedings. This practice was authorized by the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act enacted in 1996 during the Clinton presidency. The law was adopted to protect against the needless compromise of intelligence, or the means by which it was obtained. Obviously, such an authority frustrated foreign enemies in the United States by facilitating their prosecution and reducing the downside risks entailed in doing so. In the late 1990s and early years of the new century, Al-Arian was utterly obsessed with blocking secret evidence. That should not have been a surprise. After all, he had an intense self-interest in securing such a prohibition. At the time of the Al-Arians' Plant City meeting with George W. Bush, Mazen al-Najjar, Sammy's brother-in-law and his co-conspirator in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, was being held without bail, in part on the basis of such evidence. Al-Arian had to worry that if secret evidence were able to be used successfully in al-Najjar's case, the chances would greatly increase that Sammy, who also was not a U.S. citizen, would almost certainly face prosecution and deportation as well. July 2001 brought a revealing insight into Grover Norquist's value to Sammy Al-Arian and his team in connection with their campaign against secret evidence. The occasion was an event hosted by the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom, the Red-Green Popular Front Al-Arian established primarily to lobby against secret evidence, or, as David Horowitz's Front Page magazine would say, to lobby for terror. Norquist received an award for being, quote, a champion of the abolishment movement against secret evidence. When subsequently challenged on the company he was keeping and this award, Norquist insisted that he was proud of the recognition. Yet another preeminent figure in the Muslim Brotherhood's American operations is Muzamil Siddiqui. For 3 years, Siddiqui served as president of the largest Muslim Brotherhood front, the Islamic Society of North America. He's also chaired the North American Islamic Trust, a Saudi underwritten vehicle for financing the mortgages of mosques and thereby ensuring Islamist control of their services, schools, events, etc. He is currently the director of the Islamic Society of Orange County and chairman of the Executive Council of the influential Brotherhood jurisprudential front known as the Fiqh Council of North America. In 1996, Siddiqui explicitly announced his commitment to bringing Sharia to all lands, including the United States. Muzamil Siddiqui issued an ominous warning at the same October 2000 anti-Israel demonstration in Lafayette Square that was co-sponsored by Norquist's Islamic Free Market Institute and used by Abdurrahman al-Amoudi as a platform from which to declare his support for Hamas and Hezbollah. Siddiqui announced, quote, America has to learn that if you remain on the side of injustice, the wrath of God will come. Despite Siddiqui's record and associations, Thanks to the Islamic Institute team's access to the White House, he, of all Muslims in America, was chosen to represent Islam in the ecumenical memorial service held at the National Cathedral in Washington on September 14, 2001. Siddiqui was also subsequently given an audience with President Bush at the White House. He used the occasion to present a Quran to Mr. Bush. President Bush responded in a way that demonstrated his unfamiliarity with the totality of the book he had just been given, let alone the larger body of Sharia doctrine. He pronounced that, quote, "The teachings of Islam are the teachings of peace and good," unquote. Unfortunately, as Team B2 established in its report, Sharia the Threat to America, while there certainly are peaceable and tolerant teachings to be found in the Quran, it's really important to understand that the authorities of mainstream Islam consider those passages to have been supplanted by other violent and intolerant jihadist revelations that chronologically came later. This is known as Sharia's principle of abrogation. A pedigreed Sharia authority and Islamist like Muzammil Siddiqui would be under no illusion on this point and could only view President Bush's utterance as evidence of the Muslim Brotherhood's information dominance and the United States' inevitable submission to Sharia. As we noted in Part 2 of this course, such behavior was not an isolated incident during the Bush years, and as we shall see in Part 9, it has gotten infinitely worse under the Obama administration. Suffice it to say for the moment that this is the result of a sophisticated influence operation, one to which President Bush never seems to have realized he was being subjected. And that was thanks, in no small measure, to his being exposed virtually exclusively to Muslims who were waging civilization jihad against him and his country, or were enabling others to do so. How that feat was accomplished brings us to our sixth example of Islamist influence operators during the Bush years, Suhail Khan. He's arguably the most accomplished of the American Muslim Brotherhood's current generation of young leaders by virtue of his success in penetrating and conducting influence operations within not only the conservative movement and Republican Party, but inside the highest reaches of the U.S. government as well. As we shall see, this success and the degree to which Suhail Khan has yet to be held accountable for it is thanks in no small measure to his close 14-year affiliation with Grover Norquist. Suhail Khan's role in and contributions, both past and present, to the civilization jihad in America are sufficiently important to warrant a separate, more detailed case study on this influence operator. That case study is the focus of Part 4.